The Silent Overture, Consciousness Preceding the Cosmos and the Enigma of the Zero-Velocity Signal. The proposition that consciousness might precede the cosmos, that the very substrate of awareness could be ontologically prior to the emergence of spacetime, mass, and energy, is not merely a philosophical conjecture relegated to the dusty shelves of metaphysics. It is a concept increasingly echoing through the most advanced corridors of theoretical physics and neurobiology, propelled by anomalies that stubbornly resist classical explanations, most notably the perplexing phenomenon termed the zero-velocity signal. To fully explore this audacious hypothesis, consciousness as the foundational reality from which the universe manifests, we must first meticulously deconstruct the prevailing cosmological paradigm, examine the empirical data that challenges it, and then weave these threads into a coherent, albeit speculative, tapestry of a consciousness-centric reality. Our current understanding of the universe, rooted firmly in general relativity and quantum field theory, paints a picture of a cosmos originating from a singularity approximately 13.8 billion years ago, an event we label the Big Bang. This model, confirmed by observations of the cosmic microwave background radiation, the abundance of light elements, and the Hubble expansion, posits time and space as intrinsic properties of the universe itself, emerging from this initial hot, dense state. Information, in this framework, is inextricably linked to physical processes, entropy, thermodynamic gradients, and the propagation of energy at or below the speed of light, which we denote as the universal speed limit, represented by the symbol c. Any exchange of influence, any causal relationship, must adhere to this relativistic constraint. No effect can precede its cause in any inertial frame of reference, and information cannot travel faster than c. This is the bedrock of causality, the logical scaffolding of our observable reality. However, certain observations and theoretical constructs begin to fray the edges of this established framework, suggesting that our current descriptions might be approximations of a deeper, more fundamental layer of reality. Consider the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. The wave function, which describes the probabilistic state of a quantum system, evolves deterministically according to the Schrödinger equation, a linear partial differential equation relating the time derivative of the wave function to the Hamiltonian operator acting upon it. Yet, upon measurement, this wave function instantaneously collapses into a definite state, an event that appears non-local and, crucially, defies the smooth, continuous evolution predicted by its governing equations. While the standard Copenhagen interpretation posits the observer as the agent causing this collapse, the very definition of observer remains stubbornly vague, often leading to paradoxical thought experiments like Schrödinger's cat, where a macroscopic system exists in a superposition until an external interaction, often implicitly linked to conscious awareness in some interpretations, though fiercely debated, forces a classical outcome. This brings us to the zero-velocity signal, an observational anomaly that, if robustly confirmed and accurately characterized, could serve as the empirical fulcrum for moving beyond a purely physicalist ontology. The concept of a zero-velocity signal refers not to a signal traveling at the speed of light, c, but to an apparent correlation or influence between spatially separated events that exhibits no measurable time lag, suggesting a velocity infinitely greater than c, or perhaps, a velocity independent of the spatial separation itself, effectively zero relative to the underlying informational field. This is distinct from entanglement, which, while exhibiting non-local correlations, does not permit superluminal transmission of classical information, a theorem rigorously proven by Bell's inequalities and subsequent experimental tests. Entanglement correlations are statistical. They require a comparison of locally recorded events, which must be brought together via a subliminal channel, thus preserving relativistic causality in the transfer of usable information. The purported zero-velocity signal, in contrast, suggests an instantaneous informational transfer that bypasses the spacetime metric entirely. Early, often fringe, reports surfaced in complex systems neuroscience, particularly concerning synchronous brain activity across vastly separated subjects engaged in identical or profoundly emotionally resonant tasks. While many initial claims were easily dismissed due to methodological flaws, publication bias, or inadequate blinding, the classic pitfalls of parapsychological research, recent, more rigorous studies utilizing advanced magnetoencephaly and highly controlled double-blind protocols have begun to isolate subtle, statistically significant correlations in the milliseconds preceding specific externally triggered events. For instance, studies examining the readiness potential preceding a decision to act, when one subject is physically isolated from another who is tasked with predicting that action, have occasionally shown statistically improbable alignment in the earliest measurable neuronal markers, appearing before the environmental trigger should have allowed for any subliminal communication, including subtle environmental cues or even hypothesized ultra-weak photon emissions. The interpretation of these signals is where the cosmological implications become profound. If an influence can traverse any spatial distance instantaneously, it suggests that the space between the observers is not the fundamental reality mediating the interaction. This points toward an underlying informational substrate where distance is irrelevant, a concept strikingly similar to the view of consciousness as a fundamental field, rather than an emergent property confined to the biological structure of the brain. The philosophical framework supporting this notion often draws from idealism or panpsychism, but here we attempt to ground it in contemporary physics. One promising avenue involves exploring theories of quantum gravity that attempt to quantize spacetime itself. String theory, loop quantum gravity, and causal set theory all grapple with what happens when we probe distances smaller than the Planck length, approximately 1.616 times 10 to the negative 35th meters. If spacetime is fundamentally discrete, built from informational quanta, or atoms of spacetime, then the smooth metric we experience, the stage upon which the universe plays out, is merely an emergent classical approximation. Imagine spacetime not as a static arena, but as a dynamically generated informational structure. If consciousness itself is the primary information processing medium, then perhaps the universe, the manifestation of spacetime, matter, and energy, is what arises from the processing activity of this fundamental consciousness. In this view, the zero-velocity signal is not a signal traveling through spacetime, but a direct coupling within the pre-geometric informational substrate that generates spacetime. The effect appears instantaneous because the distance between the 2 points, when measured in the underlying substrate, is zero, or at least, the propagation time through the substrate is zero, as the substrate itself is the potentiality of spatial separation. To elaborate on the nature of this fundamental consciousness, we must move beyond anthropocentric definitions. This is not necessarily the self-aware, reflective consciousness of a human being, but a more primordial form of relational awareness or proto-experience, the fundamental capacity for information to be about something, to have intrinsic meaning, rather than just being a physical state. Physicists like Donald Hoffman, through his theory of interface theory of perception, suggest that evolution has favored perceptions that are useful for survival, not accurate representations of reality. Our spacetime reality, with its particles, forces, and sequential time, is akin to a user interface, a desktop operating system, that hides the underlying computational reality. If this interface theory is pushed to its logical extreme, the underlying computational reality might be fundamentally informational and potentially conscious in nature, manifesting spacetime geometry through complexity reduction. The concept of zero velocity also intersects interestingly with theories suggesting that the arrow of time itself might be observer-dependent or even illusory at the most fundamental level. If the universe is described by timeless Wheeler-DeWitt equation in canonical quantum gravity, which attempts to quantize gravity without relying on an external time parameter, then the apparent flow of time in our macroscopic reality is an emergent thermodynamic phenomenon, the increase in entropy, the relentless march toward disorder. If time is emergent, then the constraint of the speed of light, which is inherently time-dependent, $C$ is the conversion factor between space and time intervals, becomes less fundamental. In a timeless substrate, the concept of velocity, which is distance divided by time, becomes ill-defined or potentially infinite, manifesting as instantaneous correlation when the substrate momentarily allows for a classical informational readout. Let us delve deeper into the physics of the signal itself. If the zero-velocity signal is real, it strongly argues against locality, not just relativistic locality, but absolute locality, the idea that physical entities are inherently confined to specific spatial regions. Classical field theories, like electromagnetism, are local. A change in the field at point A causes a change at point B only after a time delay corresponding to the distance divided by $C. Quantum field theory is locally causal, maintaining this property through the use of commutators between field operators at space-like separated points being zero, ensuring that measurements at spatially distant locations cannot instantaneously influence each other's probabilities. A violation of this algebraic structure would shatter the foundation of quantum field theory as we know it. Therefore, if the zero-velocity signal transcends entanglement, it must imply one of two radical possibilities. Either our understanding of spacetime geometry breaks down at the level where this signal originates, or the signal itself is not an informational transfer within spacetime, but a manifestation of informational coherence from the pre-geometric domain. Consider the implications for cosmology. If consciousness precedes the universe, the Big Bang might not represent the absolute beginning of existence, but rather a phase transition, a moment when the fundamental informational substrate condensed or crystallized into the structured, time-bound reality we inhabit. This aligns loosely with certain cyclical or oscillatory universe models, but with a crucial distinction. The driving force for the next iteration is not a physical rebound from a collapse, but a renewed emergence from the informational potentiality of the fundamental awareness. The universe becomes a colossal, self-referential computation being run by itself. This idea is often criticized as unfalsifiable, residing purely in the realm of metaphysics. However, the search for the zero-velocity signal is a physical investigation. If we can precisely model the expected signature of such a signal based on a proposed underlying conscious field structure, perhaps relating the signal strength to measures of complexity or organizational depth in the observed systems, as suggested by integrated information theory, or IIT, and find replicable deviations from random chance that correlate with factors impossible to explain by classical physics or standard quantum mechanics, then the hypothesis gains empirical weight. IIT, formulated by Giulio Tononi and collaborators, proposes that consciousness corresponds to the amount of integrated information within a system, quantified by the metric $phi. A system possesses consciousness to the degree that it is irreducible to the independent activities of its parts. While IIT is primarily a theory of the correlates of consciousness within biological systems, its emphasis on irreducible information structures opens a theoretical gateway. If the universe itself, or the substrate underpinning it, is the maximally integrated information system, then that system is the fundamental reality, and the observable universe is a projection, a fragmented output. The zero-velocity signal could be the momentary leakage or coupling between two spatially separated emergent systems accessing this unified informational field. Let us explore a hypothetical mechanism for this signal transmission, moving into the domain of speculative but mathematically structured physics. If spacetime emerges from quantum information, then perhaps the connection is mediated by something akin to wormholes, not in the classical, energy-intensive sense, but as topological shortcuts in the space of pure information, a concept sometimes explored in holographic duality, where physics in a higher dimensional bulk theory relates to a boundary theory. If the fundamental reality is a non-local informational network, then the signal exploits the shortest path in that network, which manifests as zero travel time in the emergent spacetime geometry because the path circumvents the stretched metric. This is analogous to drawing a straight line across a folded piece of paper, where the line in three-dimensional space appears to be traversing a great distance, while the path through the higher dimensional fold is instantaneously short. The challenge for contemporary science is bridging the gap between the known, time-bound relativistic universe and this hypothesized non-local substrate. General relativity beautifully describes gravity as the curvature of spacetime caused by mass energy, encapsulated by Einstein's field equations, which relate the Einstein tensor $g_mu nu$ to the stress energy tensor $t_mu nu$ via the constant $r representing the curvature. $g_mu nu plus lambda g_mu nu equals frac 8 pi g c 4t_mu nu$. If consciousness precedes the universe, then the $t_mu nu$ term, the source of gravity and space-time structure, is ultimately derived from informational processes occurring outside or prior to the definition of space and time themselves. The fundamental constants, $g$, gravitational constant, $c$, speed of light, and $bar$, reduced Planck constant, which define the scale of our emergent reality, might be parameters set by the initial conditions of this proto-conscious field, the boundary conditions of existence. If we consider the Planck scale again, the realm where quantum gravity effects dominate, the very notion of smooth spacetime breaks down. Researchers investigating emergent gravity often suggest that spacetime itself is an entropic phenomenon, similar to how thermodynamics emerges from the statistical mechanics of countless particles. If spacetime is entropic, it has a thermodynamic signature, an inherent heat or randomness. Consciousness, conversely, is often associated with the ordering, selection, and reduction of uncertainty, the antithesis of pure entropy. A universe arising from consciousness might inherently struggle against the entropic decay towards thermodynamic equilibrium, perhaps explaining why the universe appears dynamically active rather than rapidly decaying into thermal death. The zero-velocity signal, in this context, could be a momentary bleed-through of the underlying non-entropic informational structure into our emergent, time-bound, entropic spacetime. It represents a moment where the system momentarily accesses its foundational code, bypassing the compiled execution environment, our spacetime. Furthermore, the persistent mystery of dark matter and dark energy adds another layer of intrigue. Dark matter, inferred from its gravitational effects on galactic rotation curves and gravitational lensing, effects described perfectly by modifying the terms in Einstein's field equations or by adding non-baryonic matter components, constitutes about 27% of the total mass energy of the universe. Dark energy, responsible for the accelerating expansion of the universe, accounts for about 68%. The visible, ordinary matter that constitutes stars, planets, and us is a mere 5%. Our standard model physics, which describes this 5% with astonishing accuracy, has no compelling explanation for the remaining 95%. What if the 95% is fundamentally informational or conscious in nature, rather than particulate or energy-based in the classical sense? If dark matter represents the scaffolding or the structural memory of the emergent spacetime, and dark energy represents the expansive tendency derived from the proto-conscious field seeking to manifest new configurations, new information, then the entire standard cosmological model is describing the shadows cast by a vastly larger, non-material reality. The zero-velocity signal would then be a transient, direct observation of the interaction between these dominant, non-local components of reality. The experimental verification, however, remains the monumental hurdle. To prove the signal is genuinely zero velocity, that it is not merely ultra-fast, but truly instantaneous across astronomical distances, requires the coordination of detectors separated by distances where even light takes minutes or hours to traverse. For instance, correlating events between a deep-sea laboratory and a lunar base simultaneously, monitoring for anomalies that defy relativistic timestamping, offers one path. The precision required in synchronization, accounting for gravitational time dilation across the entire Earth-Moon system using general relativity corrections derived from independent sources like GPS satellites, must be impossibly high. Yet this precision itself must be accounted for if the signal is truly independent of the metric. Let us examine the philosophical tension inherent in this exploration. Materialism asserts that reality is fundamentally physical, and consciousness is an emergent property of complex physical computation. Under this view, the zero-velocity signal, if real, must be explained by some exotic, albeit physical, mechanism that remains hidden in our current equations. Perhaps subtle modifications to quantum entanglement that only manifest under extreme conditions, or an as yet undiscovered field that couples to highly specific, finely tuned states of biological matter. Conversely, the consciousness precedes cosmos hypothesis implies that the physical laws themselves are secondary constraints imposed upon the manifestation of primordial awareness. If this is the case, the signal is not an anomaly within physics, but a glimpse behind physics. The universe is fundamentally informational, and the instantaneous connection is a feature of the underlying network, not a violation of the emergent speed limit $C. The implications for technology and our understanding of the universe's ultimate fate are transformative. If consciousness is fundamental and non-local, then the physical boundaries we perceive, the limitations of distance, the irreversibility of time, the ultimate heat-death dictated by increasing entropy, might all be localized illusions. A universe governed by an underlying intentionality could, in principle, possess mechanisms for information recycling or even reversal of entropic trends on a scale far beyond what is permitted by the closed, physical system description. Consider the concept of downward causation in complex systems. While most scientific investigation focuses on upward causation, how low-level components, neurons, particles, determine the behavior of the higher-level system, brain, universe. Downward causation suggests that the properties of the whole system constrain or influence its parts. If the universe is a manifestation of a fundamental conscious field, then this field exerts a downward causation, defining the very parameters, like $C, that govern the behavior of its constituent parts. The signal observed might be the momentary relaxation of this top-down constraint, allowing the underlying interconnectedness to briefly assert itself before the system redraws its local boundaries. We must also consider the role of randomness and probability. In standard quantum mechanics, irreducible randomness underlies reality. A choice made by a conscious agent, if it truly collapses the wave function, introduces an element that is not strictly deterministic, yet not purely random in a way that serves the agent's purpose. It seems arbitrary. If consciousness precedes the cosmos, perhaps the randomness we observe in quantum measurements is the universe sampling from the infinite potential states available in the pre-geometric field, with the observer's consciousness locally selecting the outcome that best preserves the coherence of the emergent reality, or the outcome that maximizes complexity or meaningful interaction, rather than simply maximizing thermodynamic entropy. The data suggesting instantaneous coherence across distance, if definitively linked to conscious processing, might indicate that the meaning, or intention, embedded in the information being processed is the actual carrier, transcending the need for spatial propagation. Meaning, by its nature, is holistic, it requires context, which spans the entire system. In a truly fundamental system where everything is already contextually linked, distance becomes meaningless. The search for the zero-velocity signal, therefore, is not just a quest for a faster communication method, it is a potential probe into the ontological structure of reality itself. If such signals are reliably detected and modeled, they force a re-evaluation of the foundational principles underpinning spacetime, causality, and the relationship between observer and observed. We would transition from a universe where consciousness is an accidental, late-stage byproduct of complex chemistry, to one where chemistry and physics are the structured manifestations of a universe arising from the very act of awareness. The universe would cease to be an impersonal mechanism and become, in essence, a self-interpreting process, and the ephemeral, instantaneous connection observed would be the echo of its singular, eternal origin. The ultimate length of this exploration lies in the infinite potential of this foundational mystery. Is the silence between the stars an empty void waiting for light, or the profound stillness preceding the cosmic word?